Okay, we are live. So, good evening, everyone, and welcome to It's Dr. Tara Tuesdays. I am your host, Dr. Tara. And as always, I want to welcome everyone to the Dr. Tara community, whether it's your first or 50th time joining me. This is a safe space where everyone is recognized as the expert of their experiences. This is a welcome platform, a welcome community. Even though we are going to be talking about a topic that is very important to me. It's a topic that has been impacting everyone. And so I invite everyone to bring their expertise into this space. If you are watching the replay, please feel free to leave a comment. So we still check the comments as well. So I just want to jump right into the conversation and discussion. Everyone, you all are in for a special treat tonight. I have joining me my former supervisor, someone who I've considered to be a great mentor to my career, Dr. Nathalie Edmond. Who is, well, I'll let you explain to everyone who you are. Can you introduce yourself, Dr. Nathalie, to the Dr. Tara community?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. It's so great to reconnect with you in this way. I am Dr. Nathalie Edmond, and I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and experienced yoga teacher in New Jersey, and I specialize in the treatment of trauma. For many years, I was a director of a women's trauma program, which is where I met Dr. Tara, and I really like the idea of mind, body, spirit integration, that when trauma happens, it lives not only in your mind and your emotions, but in your body and in your spirit. And there are many ways to heal.
Yes. So I think that brings us to this conversation. So can you, well, you introduce yourself to us, but can you talk a little bit about, Dr. Nathalie, what the topic healing from the trauma of racism, what that means to you and why this conversation is important to you?
Sure. I think particularly at this time, it seems particularly poignant. Just this idea that trauma leaves this legacy across generations, right? That trauma is anything that is frightening or anything that invokes fear and is so overwhelming that the mind and body and spirit have difficulty processing it. Sometimes it has no words. And I think about racism as something that's often neglected as a daily trauma that many Black, Indigenous people of color experience.
Mm-hmm. When hearing you say that, one of the things that I've often talked about looking at racism through the lens of trauma is like people's ability to build up a trauma tolerance to it. So when you talked about racism as being something that is experienced or even expected on a daily basis, like I gave the example earlier today of being pulled over by a police officer. I remember doing a training and I asked white people and black people, black people and people of color, what would be a great day? And white people, if I didn't get a ticket, if they let me off with a warning, and then the black people of color were like, if I don't get killed, if I don't get taken, right? And so the trauma tolerance is so large, meaning that it takes so much, and I've expected so much of that. So understanding that racism can be something that we not only experience, but we also expect. How do we even begin to assess whether or not we've been impacted traumatically from racism?
Right, yeah. Well, I guess I think as a Black, Indigenous person of color, if you identify in any of those ways, that I think it's hard not to experience racism on an almost daily basis. And so sometimes it can be quite subtle. And I think what's so interesting is that the body knows the difference, right? Even if the mind has learned to tell itself a story about what's happening so that we can cope with our daily life, the body remembers and we go into the same stress response, right? So when we've been conditioned for survival to, let's say, when we see a police officer, to know that we need to behave in a particular way just to survive, which white people often don't have that similar fear, is that the body automatically goes into fight, flight, or freeze. It automatically does that. And that's just the way our nervous system was designed to be. But if we do that repeatedly over time, so if on a daily basis or even a weekly basis, my body has to go into the stress response, then that accumulates in the system over time. And so then the body starts to affect all kinds of systems, in whether it's our health or whether it's our emotional well-being or our relationships. There are all these ways that it impacts us.
I appreciate what you're saying about the manifestations. I think one of the things that has happened just even over the past week, as a part of the trauma response, is people's push, like I'm going to push through, which is also to me pretty traumatic, right? The need to feel like I have to keep going after not only am I having a physical response, but I'm having an emotional response and I'm having a mental response. And so when we think about racism as a system that is there, how do you begin to learn how to navigate through it versus cower to it?
Right. Well, I'm always amazed by human beings' amazing ability to just be resilient,
Mm-hmm.
and to that we just find these ways to push through. And so I think about sometimes we might not even think that we're impacted by this stuff. I think about just not only the past week, but just the last couple of years where technology has been so evident that we've been able to see the ways in which Black lives have been murdered, or just like some of the explicit racist acts that have been performed. We see it on TV, we see it on our social media feed, and we watch it over and over again sometimes. And I think that even though it's not directly happening to us, our bodies can still have that experience of seeing somebody who looks like us in skin tone having, this horrific experience. And so I think first step is just to acknowledge that we're having a response and that it's okay to have a response. And that sometimes our way of surviving is to not feel, right? And we have a lot of different ways to not feel, a lot of ways to distract. Some of that could be, through, a alcoholic beverage, or it could be through just distracting through binge watching something. So we have all these mechanisms to just push it away and push it away and push it away, but eventually it catches up to us in some pretty dramatic ways.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things too, just hearing you talk about this, Dr. Nathalie, is again, like the trauma tolerance or the trauma response to lack of self-care. So I notice that I'm having this overwhelming response and I'm trying to distract, or I'm eating, or I haven't learned to then, I'm noticing it, but I don't know how to respond to it. Can you speak a little bit about, okay, well, once you notice it, this is then a step that you do? Because I think that self-care, and something that we've talked about in the Dr. Power community too, is how for so many of us, self-care comes at literally the point of exhaustion, right? Then take a nap when I can't do anything else but take a nap, right? It's a nap or go to the hospital. One of those.
Right. Yeah, it's been interesting, just like in the last year, thinking more about how napping and resting is really a privilege, and that it takes a lot to give ourselves permission to nap or to rest, and how that is so critical for us is to take more time to rest. But so often we wait till we get to that extreme, and part of that is that we get so out of tune with our bodies that we don't even realize that we're operating on empty. And then I think we see the extremes, right? That some people's nervous system kind of shuts down, and so people experience depression or lack of energy, or just this feeling of numbness, which is part of the way that they survive. And then we see other people who have to keep busy. They're always doing something. They're, making food for people. They're taking care of people. They're working multiple jobs and trying to take care of their communities. And then we also see the people who are having panic attacks and who are raging in ways that are not healthy or helpful to them. But there's just so much emotion that was shut down for so long that it kind of explodes. We see that not only in adults, but we see that particularly in kids and adolescents as well, as they don't have words to describe just what they're taking in the media, and it has to come out in some way. And so I think about after, how do we give ourselves permission to rest? And how do we give ourselves permission to, if we acknowledge that racism is a daily occurrence, what are the things we're doing on a daily basis to take care of ourselves, so that, we can't stop the racist acts that are happening, but we can change the way that we show up to our lives in terms of, where do we have control in terms of our own self-care?
Can you speak a little bit to, I have two questions. Can you speak a little bit to people who believe that, whether they believe it consciously or unconsciously, but it's still there. So I remember having a conversation on Friday night with a group of moms, and we were talking about ways to talk to their children. And so one of the things that trauma triggers in you is fear. And so many of them openly acknowledge, I teach racism through the lens of you can't do these things, or if this happens to you, do this, or people aren't going to see you as this. You have to be twice as good. You have to be whatever. And the intention is there, right? I want to protect my child. But what is also happening is that I'm scaring my child too. Mm-hmm. And so how do parents navigate their own fears in having conversations, especially Black Indigenous people, around their own fears in teaching their children about a system, like you said, that is there?
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's so tricky, right? Because I think it comes down to multiple truths, right? It's like, I almost feel like it's negligent not to teach your child about the system of racism, right? Because this is something that's operating on so many, it's just in the air that we breathe. And so we have to educate people about the system. And within that, we also want to build up our kids, right? We want to build up so that they can reach their potential. And so I think some of it is about seeing where is their choice, where are there opportunities for our kids to really shine. And also with that is, how do we also remind them of their humanity, right? That the system may treat them as if they don't matter, but that we love them and we care about them, and that it's not fair that this is what they have to, the burden that they have to carry, that the lens that they have to operate in the world in. And I think it's so important to have community where there are places in which they can let their guard down, where they can just be themselves. It's so important to balance out, so that I think that shifting, right, that you don't always have to have the armor on, that there are places where you can just relax, and that the body can relax into that.
What do you say to parents? I got a inbox about this. What do you say to parents where the belief is, I can't let my guard down because the world is not going to be nice, right? Almost like I'm preparing them for the world. Like that is the defense. I'm preparing them for a world that is not going to be nice to them, that is not going to be respectful of them. How if I'm a parent that believes that or has that philosophy, which is very real, mm-hmm. How do I begin to be open to what you're saying?
Right. Well, I mean, I think first it goes back to that acknowledging, right? Acknowledging your own racial trauma, right? Like you have your own life experiences, that have left an imprint on you, right? And so your experience is that the world is not nice, right? And so it's important to relay that information to your child. And at the same time, are there possibilities where that can be challenged in small ways, right? Like, are there places in which there are allies, right? That there are supports, that there are people who have a better understanding of racism and are actively working to change that, right? Thinking about how important it is to expose our children to people who don't look like them, who can be supportive, right? Because if we think everyone is our enemy, right, that's a certain kind of stress response that gets activated. And so I think about teaching our kids to be able to tell the difference between people who are supportive of them and people who are not. And because I think part of the trauma response is that I can't let my guard down. I mean, that is a trauma response right there. Is just that language, is that the world is against me, the system wasn't built, and all of these are based on truth, right? I mean, these are things that they've learned the hard way, or that were passed down through the generations to help them survive. And yet, we have to start to interrupt that trauma that passes through the generations.
Mm-hmm. I want to go to Shamia's comment, and you've already started to talk about it, Dr. Nathalie, but as a parent or even as a person, how do we begin to challenge ourselves? And so is it the same type of framework that you said do for our children, like do exposure to being open to other options or other truths, right? So my truth, like you said, that and yet, which I use all the time, people know, mm-hmm. But this has happened to me, and yet I may still be able to find someone who is able to be supportive or be an ally.
Right. I think about what are some small risks that we can take, right? And so what's something small that I can do and see how people show up, right? That we'll be, because we have this hypervigilance to protect ourselves, we'll know pretty soon if someone can't be trusted, right? And I also think about just this idea that people can grow and evolve. Like even even like last week, I was, pretty sad about what I was seeing after the murder of George Floyd. And yet what I noticed on my social media feed was that it felt different. It felt like, I think particularly my white friends on social media, that they were showing up in a different way. And it was clear, that some of them, had more understanding of the system and the history, and others were just starting to kind of wake up to these things. But it really felt like they were starting to stand up for justice, and that was really hopeful. And I think that it's so easy to only see the darkness, the despair, the ways in which anti-Blackness culture persists. And yet I think we need to have those glimmers, right? And I love that word glimmers, is like that moment here and there where you see the light, where you see the hope, you see the possibility of us working in solidarity together.
Mm-hmm. One of the things too that I want to touch on too, because the parenting piece has been such a big part. One of the things that I have been mindful to talk to parents about is educating their children, about racism through the lens of trauma. So in equity work in the schools, one of the pushbacks I've often given to schools or school districts is how people of color, Black people, are introduced to children, right? Are they introduced to the lens of slavery, which is traumatic, or are they introduced to the lens of being a person or being an explorer, being curious? And oftentimes, inadvertently, a lot of parents are not talking to their children about race unless it's through the lens of trauma, right? Mm-hmm. Who are not going to see you, and so how can you speak to how, if I'm doing that, how that may inadvertently shape my child's identity of themselves if I'm being exposed to myself through this lens of lack, or like you said, or survival mode as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think just thinking about like how much influence there is in being able to show different models for what's possible for people, right? I think about how when we're so young that our brain has like so many options for how it will develop, right? And that continues throughout our lifespan. But I think particularly like the younger we are, just like the neural pathways are forming so quickly, right? And I mean, they're forming our entire life, but like when in those first 10 years, they're just so rapidly fusing together. And so I think the ability to balance curiosity with survival skills, right? Like it's that balance that we need both, right? Because this idea of there's so many things that are stacked against, Black and Indigenous kids, and so they're going to get enough in the media that says that they're not enough, or that certain doors are closed, and that we don't have to inadvertently give them more of those messages, right? And so, like, how do we help them build skills, different kinds of skills, to be able to tolerate or navigate the challenges and stressors that they will experience without us inadvertently demoralizing them, I guess is the challenge as a parent. And I think every kid is different, right? Because it's not one size fits all, because some kids are incredibly sensitive, right? Like I have two young kids, right? And my son who's the older one, he's super sensitive. So like when I talk to him about race stuff, like he feels that deeply. Mm-hmm. And my daughter, who's younger, she's just more easygoing. So like for her, just kind of rolls off her back. And so I think diversifying or adapting your parenting to fit your kids' emotional style or sensitivities is really important, because what works for one kid isn't going to work for the other kid.
I love that. And I think so oftentimes when we experience a situation like this, which we have seen over and over again, it automatically triggers so many parents into, I have to talk to my children right now. We're going to have this conversation. And it's coming, that conversation is led by fear, which often comes out through the lens of control, which is the way that we have parented for generations, right? I mean, because we've had to. And so I love what you said, giving ourselves permission to think about it differently, or expose ourselves as parents to something, or even people. I mean, not just for parents, I've seen this, but I've seen, people posting about, well, I have a brother, I have a father, or even myself, to say my name with Brianna, and so giving ourselves the opportunity to deal with this from a compassionate lens versus a fear-based lens versus I can't do this, but what is it that I can do? And speaking to those swimmers. Mm-hmm.
Right. I love this idea of I think about fear, right? That fear can be channeled in a lot of different ways, right? That there's, when I think of stress, I think of different kinds of stress, right? So there's stress that is kind of the stress that we think about, like when we're doing something exciting, right? There's that kind of stress, like we're getting married or we're graduating, we're buying a car, like those could be like happy kinds of stressors, right? Versus like the stress that's related to trauma, right? And so thinking about how do we navigate that so that we kind of try to reduce or minimize our exposure to the traumatic stress. Because, we can't avoid it totally, but the accumulation of repeated stressors. And sometimes what happens is if we spend too much time thinking about, traumatic stress, I mean, that we're having a stress response just by thinking about it, right? And so we can't stop the reality that we live in a racist society. And yet there are ways in which we don't have to feed into that system more so than we already have.
That leads me to my next question. So over the past 2 weeks, I want to say I have held maybe about 7 or 8 process groups for Black employees or Black people of networks who needed their own space. And one of the things that has often come up, and if you're in the comments, give me a thumbs up if you can relate to this, was feeling like one of the tasks that Black people have often been asked to do is share their stories of pain, which I equate to trauma stories, in order to educate their white counterparts, or having conversations about race where it turns into, let me try to convince you that this is real. Any thoughts about this before I say, how do we not do this?
I think my first thought was that I think that white people need to do their own work. I mean, that's my first thought, is that white people need to do their own work, because there's lots of ways in which that they can find out this information without Black, Indigenous, people of color doing the emotional labor of telling their stories, right? And I think that if it helps a Black person to tell their story, if that feels helpful to them in their journey, in their process, in their healing, kudos to you, right? But if it feels like too much emotional labor, then I would say to really check in with yourself about, why are you doing this, right? And can you direct people to other places, right? And I think this idea of there's so many resources out there at this point that people can really find out this information. And at the end of the day, that white people need to talk to other white people about learning the history, right? And to figure out how they can show up as allies or accomplices or advocates in a way that allows Black people to rest, or allows Black people to be able to voice what they need to happen in the system to change it, to make it so that we are not traumatized on such a regular basis.
When you think about the healing process, and Nathalie, if you can connect it to not just the mind, but also to the body, and I love how you talk about like the soul piece too. How does self-care fit into the healing process of healing from racism? So many people, just over the past week, self-care didn't even feel like an option. And so can you just speak to the importance of self-care and giving ourselves permission for it, not just in times like these, but especially in times like this?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I guess I think of self-care as such a privilege, right? And I also think that it's rebellious in some ways, right? That in a culture that doesn't tend to support on a systemic level the self-care and well-being of Black people, that to take some time to take care of yourself is revolutionary, right? And it's an act of rebellion, right? And so when I think of self-care, I think that it can show up in a lot of different ways, right? So self-care could be taking a nap, literally. But self-care could be eating your favorite meal. It could be getting together with a friend. It could be like painting your toenails. It could be reading a book, listening to music, having a little dance. There are all these ways in which it's so nourishing to the spirit, to our souls, to be able to have some joy. So self-care can be joyous, right? And I think when we're exhausted, it's so hard to enjoy things, right? And because when we're exhausted, we're in a stress response, really, right? That exhaustion is just the system saying we're so depleted. And so how do I think of it almost like as a piggy bank, right? That we want to put more deposits in than withdrawals, right? And if we're having, I personally chose never to watch the George Floyd murder video. Like that was not part of my self-care, because what was it going to do for me, right? Then I would have those images in my mind. And that doesn't mean that I don't keep up with what's happening. It's just that I'm not going to allow certain images to come into my body, into my mind, into my spirit, right? And so I think to check in with ourselves, like I have a daily meditation practice that I do every morning as a way to start my day. And that's my self-care, because it helps me check in with my body, my mind, my spirit, what's going on. It helps clear the clutter in my mind. It helps me center and anchor, right? And some days it's really emotional. And so but at least I give myself, those 10, 20 minutes in the beginning of the day to be able to be with myself before I get ready to be out there in the world.
Mm-hmm. I want to acknowledge and honor Shamia's comment. She said exactly when you were talking about sharing stories of trauma or racism. I feel like now, as one of the handful of Black women, people are expecting us to be the ones to say something and educate white employees. Do you have any thoughts or feedback about how to gracefully decline that conversation? If I feel like it's too much, I want to also acknowledge to Dr. Nathalie, like you said, if it's helpful to me to share, then share. But if I'm noticing that it doesn't, but I still feel that pull to be a part of the organization, or that pressure that so many people of color wear, like Shamia was saying, being either the only or a handful, where all eyes are on me in the classroom, or all eyes are on me in the workplace. How do I navigate that space to decline that part?
Sure. I guess my default phrase would be something like, I'm so glad that you're interested in this topic, and I have some wonderful resources that you can check out.
The end.
Yep. Here's some links. Here's some videos. Yep.
In your trauma work, Dr. Nathalie, have you seen racism or the traumatic impacts of racism manifest itself differently in Black men and Black women? I think as far as like socially acceptable emotional sharing, or we've had conversations about Black men and emotions, Black women and emotions. Have you seen it manifest itself differently between Black men and Black women? I'll start there, and then I'll add some other questions.
I think for me, the gender difference is pretty significant in terms of, particularly with Black women, is that I see a lot of this superwoman phenomenon, right? And this idea of never letting your guard down, taking care of everything. And like the myth of needing to be strong and not crying and not being emotional in any way, or the extreme of being extremely emotional, but in a rageful way, right? So that emotions of sadness or fear is not something that is expressed. And I mean, I think what's really sad is what we see is like the high blood pressure, the heart attacks, cholesterol levels. We see all the physical health issues that manifest. So I think sometimes it's that people are going to medical doctors and addressing the physical health issues, not recognizing that it's probably, some of the vulnerabilities towards some of those medical issues is the unresolved trauma, the unresolved emotions that live in the body, right? And I mean, if we look at the statistics of the number of Black women who are dying at a younger age because the stress, the impact it has on their body over time.
I literally had to grip my chair because I wanted to be like, yes, I'm about to start. Some of us are going to medical doctors when we need to go to a therapist. It's stress, right? You know, and so owning that and honoring that too, and giving up that superwoman piece or that angry woman piece too. And so acknowledging that too. Can you speak a little bit from the Black male side, what you see, how that manifests as well?
Yeah, I mean, I wish that I saw more Black men in therapy, honestly. I really, really do. I also wish that I saw more Black male therapists as well. I think that would help a lot. But I mean, what's so interesting is I feel like I have a soft spot in my heart for Black men who come to therapy because it just takes so much longer to like dive into it because there's just so many layers of defense or protection around really addressing some things. Like I think like at least what I've heard from a lot of my Black male clients is the trauma of some of their childhood, right? The ways in which maybe they didn't have a father figure present and the lasting impact that that's had on their life, right? And the ways in which they might have difficulty naming their emotions, expressing their emotions, being vulnerable, not trusting, right? Like these are all things that show up for them too. And I mean, they have the same physical health issues as well, but just it shows up in different ways for them.
Thank you. I want to address Sandra's comment. I think it speaks to a deeper level of like internalized racism. So she said she's never experienced racism by white people, but was felt bullied by Black communities. And then she was saying she got fired by a white manager when working at a movie theater. Can you speak? I want to just talk about the first part, how when you experience trauma, how that causes you to look at yourself and others who look like you or you have similarities to you, and how that may manifest in that way.
Sure. I mean, I think internalized racism is so powerful. And I mean, I think that's part of kind of this white supremacist system, right? Is that we start to buy into some of those stereotypes of how people are and how they should be. And so I think we start to turn on each other, or we start to evaluate each other based on these assumptions that we have. And so I mean, I think that could be so traumatizing to not feel accepted and supported by people who look like you. Like it's so important to feel affirmed in so many parts of your life. So I think about that requires a lot of self-reflection to understand, like, why am I doing these things? Why am I saying these things? What is it about my own self-love or lack of self-love, right? Because I think that people hurt other people because they have their own pain that they haven't addressed, right? Because if I feel really good in my own skin, then I have no need to bring other people down.
So funny, I remember having a client, and I always remember what you said, and I remember talking to you about the frustration that she made me feel. And you said to me, well, imagine how she makes herself feel, right? Like if the frustration that you get is only a proof of the frustration that she's causing herself. And that's how I think about internalized racism, right? So the bias that I'm giving to someone based on shadeism or hair or whatever is only a fraction of what I'm using to evaluate my own worthiness or perceived worthiness. And so allowing ourselves to sit and wrestle and reflect on that too.
Yeah, I think about how shame is so powerful, right? And so the shame I think about is like, there's something wrong with me. I mean, that's to me the definition of shame. Like not that I did something wrong, but that there is something fundamentally wrong with me, right? And I think that's part of the legacy of racism, right? Is that it has us start to doubt who we are or our value or our worth. Or it makes us think that unless we're accomplishing certain things or buying certain things or achieving a certain level of status, that we don't matter or we're not worthy.
Oh, yes, Natalie, it does. And then and I think too, you get that I'm going to be a workaholic, right? I'm going to just work my way, and so I miss these things. Which all, to me, go away from our sense of community and who we are as a people. And so
Right.
those very individualistic ideals in societies. I want to acknowledge Christina's question. She said, do you think that conversations look different with mixed race children around racism?
I imagine it depends on what the mixed race is. I mean, I think my own personal experience from having biracial children is that I think that the conversation for me isn't that different because I'm preparing them to live in a society in which there's a high anti-Blackness culture. So I want them to, so I almost like err on the side of Blackness. And so I probably have the same conversation with them because I assume that people will view them as Black, even though they're lighter skinned. And so, I mean, I think that's part of the sorrow and the burden of parenting is how do we prepare our children to navigate this world in a way that sets them up for success, knowing that the system wasn't built for them to be successful.
It makes me think of a James Baldwin quote where he talks about race and parenting and parenting Black children. And the goal of parenting Black children is to have them understand like that while they will be despised, that they won't begin to despise themselves.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's beautiful. Yeah, I think that's beautiful, right? Is how do we externalize the racism versus internalizing the racism, which makes us feel bad about ourselves, right? And I think that's the dance, right? Is either I internalize it and I feel shame and sadness, or externalize it and I feel rage, right? And so it's kind of like, and is there a possibility for peace within this kind of really biased system? And I think, yes, there is the possibility for peace. But it takes a lot of time and energy and reflection and rest and self-care to be able to check in with ourselves, right? Because I think we can get into this like where we just put it on the shelf or we stuff it way down versus like checking in with ourselves, whether it's through meditation or prayer or journaling or a girlfriend or, that we need to be able to talk about this stuff, right? So that it doesn't live in our tissues, it doesn't live in our bodies, that we need to be able to grieve together, to decide how we're going to support our communities together to bring about change.
Natalie, someone sent me a message asking, can you speak a little bit more to, you just started, like how the trauma lives in our bodies? Like they caught the first part, but they didn't really understand when you think about the racism. It made me think of the book, The Body Keeps Score. Can you speak a little bit more about that so people have an understanding of what they may start to experience, the physical manifestations of the trauma?
Sure. So it's so interesting, right, that when I think about the way that our trauma response is that some of us, when we experience trauma, we go into this submit mode, right, where we kind of collapse. And I think the hallmark sign of collapse or submit is the rounding of the shoulders. I don't know if you'll be able to see it, but like I start to go like this. So like my shoulders round like this. And like I might even avert eye contact. So I might be looking down. And the whole premise of that is to kind of make myself a little bit smaller, less intimidating, and to make myself a little bit more invisible, right? And so for some of us, it kind of just happens automatically, or if we've had enough experiences of being beat down, that like the body just kind of like sags. And so if you do that once in a while, it's whatever. But if that's your repeated experience, you start to move around the world in that way, and the body kind of learns to just rest in that way. And we have to actively do things that are opposite of that, to like lengthen the spine, or to like lift my chin up, or to draw my shoulders back so my heart lifts up, right? Which helps me breathe a little bit more easily, right? And just thinking about if people like actually round their shoulders, like there's a depressive kind of feeling that goes with that. And the contrary, right? The fight response, right, is more about like I puff up my chest and I draw my shoulders back, and there's kind of a rigidity and a tenseness where it's kind of like I'm prepared for war all the time, right? That I'm going to make sure that you don't come after me by having that kind of stance. And it's so interesting that the body kind of just does that automatically, especially if that's the way that you've had to survive, right? If you've had to be tough, if you've had to appear as though nothing ever gets to you, or kind of like attack first before you're attacked, those are all trauma responses, right? Because the body is saying it's not safe. It's not safe for me to be relaxed. It's not safe for me to be visible. It's not safe for me to just relax into this moment because I'm always prepared for danger.
And so say I'm there. So say I notice that when I'm having these conversations, I'm doing this, or I'm this, I'm on edge.
Right.
How do what is the first step? I know you talk about acknowledgement, but like for people who are, I'm there, tell me what to do.
Right, sure, yeah. So I notice for myself, like when I'm in fight mode and I start to get agitated, I start to notice, like I pause and I feel where my feet are, right, which helps me drop in, right? And then I'm like, okay, can I bring my back to actually touch the chair? Because when I'm here, I'm like ready to like say something or to attack you and so like, can I just draw myself back, right? And can I feel the support of the chair on my back, which just kind of grounds me and helps me remember like, okay, and just taking those few extra seconds might allow my brain to have a little bit more space. I might still be pretty heated, but I'll have a little bit more space to decide what do I actually want to say or do in this next moment, right? And I think if I tend to be like this, can I just slowly lengthen? Or I teach a lot of breath work, right? So just allowing people to start to connect with their breath, right? Just to start to connect to their breath. And it doesn't have to be anything fancy. It could just be an inhale and an exhale. And I think about when we don't have a lot of energy, right? And we're kind of like more of a sad or depressive feeling, I want to focus on my inhale because that energizes me. And when I'm agitated and anxious and irritable, I want to focus more on my exhale because that calms me. So I want to lengthen my exhale because if my exhale is longer, so maybe I inhale for 2, exhale for 5, like that will calm my nervous system down, right? And it's this whole idea that if I calm my body down, the mind follows, right? Like I can keep telling myself to calm down, but I'm in this agitated state. So it's better for me to work on calming my body down.
And then I'm going to again open up the comments for people who have comments, questions for you. One of the things that people are talking about is the doubting of our identity or not feeling accepted. Can you talk a little bit about, Dr. Nathalie, about how we start to gain that acceptance or creating our own identity for ourselves and not looking for, like you said, an anti-Black or a racist society to give that to us when it works so hard to do that?
Yeah. I mean, and I think this is where we have to create intentional spaces to affirm ourselves, right? Because I think it's this dance of, right, is that it's part of internalizing positive messages about my Blackness is by surrounding myself with Black beauty, Black excellence, right? Is that I need to do this in community, but I need to do it in communities that affirm me, right? And then I need to also do my inner work of like what gets in the way of me seeing how amazing I already am, right? Without even accomplishing anything, that I'm already amazing, right? And I think about how in certain communities, particularly white communities, they have access to all of these kinds of resources, all of these things, because they on a daily basis are affirmed, right? They see themselves in TV and movies and magazines and books. And so without trying that hard, they are affirmed in many ways, right? And we have to work a little bit harder to be affirmed because of the anti-Blackness culture. So I think about ways in which we can lift each other up, ways in which we can compliment each other. Because I think sometimes because we're so afraid, right? I think particularly in parenting, because we're so afraid, we can tend to shame and criticize when we need to be lifting people up, right? This idea that people actually do better when they're complimented, like positive reinforcement goes a whole lot further than punishment does. And yet punishment is much easier to do, right? Because we see a behavior that scares us or that we don't like, and so we address it right then and there. But really, positive reinforcement, like we see something that we like or that we want someone to do more of, and we acknowledge it. And so that just takes time and energy, right? It's so much easier for me to criticize my son for this and that. But it would be so much better for me to say, like, what, you did an amazing job with this video that you made, right? To see his strengths and abilities and to really harness that so that he can go out. Because if he feels good about himself, then he's more motivated, he's more driven, he's able to move around in the world in a different way.
And he's also able to like come to you or come to someone else who's safe versus it, like, again, internalizing it and keeping it in. I remember with hearing you talk about punishment, I remember doing a session and someone was talking about how when they experienced racism, it turned into them, like you said, them shaming themselves. I'm punishing myself, or I'm punishing my child, or I'm punishing someone I care about based on the behaviors of someone else, right? Racism teaches, if I dress better, if I did this, then I wouldn't do it. It almost reminds me of this very unhealthy domestic relation. You know, if you did this better, then I wouldn't hurt you, which is such a far a great non-truth, you know. And so, but we believe that, and we internalize that too. And so I love what you said about that reinforcement for ourselves first, and then sprinkling it to other people in our lives as well. Dr. Nathalie, as we get ready to close, these 50 minutes have gone by very, very fast. One of the things that I always ask our guests are 3 takeaway points for someone who wants to begin their healing process from the trauma of racism.
Oh, 3. I guess I think one is I think to talk to each other, right? That I think that we have to be able to talk to each other, or to find safe spaces to be able to be our full selves, right? That is so critical for all parts of ourselves to be able to show up. 2 is to recognize that there are consequences of racism, right? And so that shows up differently, and there isn't a better way for it to show up. It's just, these are our ways of surviving. Like, I take a strength-based approach to most things, and this idea that however you are surviving racism, kudos to you. And to pause and examine what's the consequences of the ways in which you are surviving, and is it possible for you to thrive, right? And so this idea of how do we move from surviving to thriving, and maybe it's like little steps every day that you can take. And so I invite people to think, it's like, what's one thing that you can do today to move you towards thriving, right? And so maybe that is that I'm going to just take out 15 minutes of my day to just be me time, right? And to really be committed to that, because there will always be more crises, there will always be more racist acts. And how do I pause and check in with myself about what do I need today? Because it is a marathon, right? And so how do we live the longest, fullest life that we possibly can?
Thank you so much, Dr. Nathalie. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your calm expertise at all times. I think for me, just hearing you talk about, the connection for me, I think, went off in my mind. So many of us are going to doctors instead of therapists when it's really a emotional feeling, and how it manifests itself. And because that's a totally different Dr. Tar Tuesdays, but so many of us have made peace with our health being poor, right? Like, oh, that's just what it is. And so, being able to acknowledge that I deserve to have a good quality of life, in all areas. And I think that you spoke so well, and just giving us tools to look at our body language, our posture, and the importance of movement, and giving ourselves permission wherever we are in the process. And I love what you said, however you have been. To be a Black or brown person in this world means that you have experienced racism, means that you have experienced the trauma of racism. So that's step one. And then kudos to you for however you've been navigating it. So thank you so much for your expertise. People are saying thank you. This was awesome. And so thank you so much. I want to tell everyone that we are having, this is a 2-for-1 week. We're actually having a Dr. Tara Thursdays this week too. So you all pray my sleep schedule stays on track. On Thursday, I'll be joined for part 2 of our co-parenting with the person with narcissism with Dr. Brianna Boyd. We're going to dive into boundaries. And then next Tuesday, we'll have part 2 of this discussion with Ms. Shauna Murray Brown, a licensed clinical social worker who will be talking to us about more, and she's very similar to you, Dr. Nathalie, that healing body work and getting our awareness increased about how tension and trauma manifests itself in our bodies and what we can do about it. So Dr. Nathalie, thank you so much. Oh, before you all leave, Dr. Nathalie is on Facebook. She's on social media. I shared one of her, one of your resources about racism is not binary. Can you tell people how to connect with you? And Shamia, can you put it in the comments?
Sure. My website is mmcounselingcenter.com, as in M&M, counselingcenter.com. So you can find out all about me and the clinicians in my practice. I have a whole page on anti-racism resources, and I've created some YouTube videos as well, just to help, if you have some white people in your life who need to understand racism and you don't want to teach them, just send them to my website page. There you go. And Dr. Nat Edmond, you can find me on Instagram, and my Facebook page is Mindful and Multicultural Commit to Sit, because I just believe that meditation and yoga are strategies that we as Black people can start to incorporate in our lives to help us heal.
And then what's your YouTube channel again, Dr. Nathalie?
Mindful and Multicultural Counseling.
Mindful and Multicultural Counseling. We'll put all of that in the comments so everyone can stay connected with you and follow you and get resources from you. So thank you again so much, Dr. Nathalie. Everyone have a great evening. And as always, let's heal together. Peace.
Yes, thank you. Take care.